Okay, thank you for this opportunity to share some of our research in Cambodia and in other parts of Asia. Love 146 are committed to doing good research, and we're trying to do research in this particular area of sexual exploitation of young men and transgender. Today I'm going to be presenting to you a series of PowerPoint slides, and this first slide is giving the objectives. So the first one is to understand some of the ways young men are involved in sexual exploitation in Asia as exploiters and exploited, to dispel some of the myths surrounding sexual exploitation of boys and consider possible interventions, and to consider the role of the secular and faith-based NGO communities. Now, if we look at what the traditional feminist and human rights analysis of trafficking is, the sex industry and its growth is predicted on different things. One is a male-centered ideological assumptions that sex is a male right, an entitlement as well as commodity that should be readily accessible to men. Women are sexualized commodities functional to that male right, and trafficking is rooted in the stereotypical constructions of the social roles of women and men. The challenge is that in this particular case, we're talking about boys as victims. What happens then? Well, men and boys are sexually exploited, but culturally, men and boys are not seen as vulnerable. However, the statistics might not be as diverse as we might think. If we look at different international research around the world, it's pretty much considered, it's understood that 1 in 4 girls have been sexually abused, but 1 in 6 boys have been sexually abused. 1 in 6. Well, in the research that I conducted in 2005, we found that 18.9% of boys aged 12 to 15 years said that they had been sexually abused or touched on the genitals since they were 9 years old. That was in quite an extensive national survey of about 1,318 children, and so that was the statistics that we found with that. There's a Cambodian proverb that says a girl is like a piece of cloth. If it's stained, then it's spoiled forever, but a boy is like a piece of gold. If it's dropped in the mud, then it can easily be washed clean again. Now, the challenge with that is that both of those statements can be unhelpful. For the girl in Cambodia, it means that basically once she's been sexually abused, then she's been violated, and it's very difficult for anyone to see her as anything other than what's termed broken woman or broken girl. Now, you might think that that's worse, far worse than the description of a boy, but the challenge is with the description of gold is that the implication is that basically it can just be washed clean and there's no problem. So the implication is that for girls that really their life's over, but for boys there's no problem at all, so why is everyone making such a fuss? That is not helpful. Now, the interesting thing is that each culture has similar stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. For example, in our Western culture, we have the story of Sleeping Beauty versus Aladdin. Now, these are not just Disney films, they're also stories that go back many hundreds of years that resonate in our culture. Sleeping Beauty is seen as the vulnerable girl. She's so vulnerable that she's up in the tower waiting to be rescued by the handsome prince, so vulnerable that she's asleep. And in comparison, you have the picture of Aladdin, who's a resilient boy. He's the one who can just about do anything. He's streetwise, he'll manage to survive whatever's thrown at him. So why is sexual exploitation of boys largely ignored? Well, first of all, society says that boys are not victims, and they choose to be involved because they're gay. But many of the boys that we've spoken to in our research say that they're not gay, that they have no choice, and that they need to support their family. Christian groups often don't want to be seen as pro-gay, and secular groups don't want to be seen as anti-gay. So you end up with basically a group which no one seems to be doing anything much about. It's also challenging for the LGBT community because, as I mentioned, there are a number of young men who don't self-identify as gay, and yet they're involved in sex work, and so they don't quite fit within their grouping either. Now, in Asia, we know that virginity is highly prized in girls. Boys are seen as that they can't get pregnant, and the risk of violence is largely ignored. So, for example, I remember speaking to somebody in Sri Lanka, and they said one of the sayings there is that a ship in port doesn't leave a trace, which meant that if a boy is sexually abused, then it's really doesn't leave, there's no significant thing. Whereas for a girl, of course, she loses her virginity and then there's the possibility of pregnancy. Of course, it can leave a trace in that it can lead to STIs, it can lead to HIV, it can lead to psychological problems that are long-lasting. So what are some of the misconceptions about sexual exploitation of boys? Well, boys are not seen as sexual objects and are often not targets of sexual exploiters. That's a myth. Sexual exploitation of boys is perpetrated only by men of homosexual orientation. That's a myth. Exploiters are mostly foreigners. That's not true. Boys consent to have sex with women. That's not always the case. Therefore, they are not victims when women are biased. Sexual exploitation of boys is limited to more open societies, whereas it seems to be happening in every country in the world. The magnitude of the problem is small. Well, the challenge with that last statement, of course, is that you can only find out if you do the necessary research to find out. And it's always a challenge to find prevalence of any type of sexual exploitation, but particularly this issue, which is very hidden, is even more difficult. So I would suggest the problem is not quite as small as we'd like to think. Why is sexual exploitation of boys largely ignored in research? Well, if we look at some of the research, like, for example, Dennis in 2008 did a review of 166 scholarly articles on the global sex industry, 84% were exclusively discussed female sex workers and made no mention at all of males. Research often views males in the sex industry as liabilities for sexual health rather than vulnerable human beings that can be damaged. This is why I think it's very important for us to focus on this. It just really does seem that if you look at the research, that mostly the research that's done in this area is being done that looks at HIV. Maybe that's where the money is, but if we only treat people, sex workers and others, in this way, then we're doing them a huge disservice because we're not looking at their other needs and vulnerabilities as well. Now, ECPAT did some significant studies in the 2006. 3 ECPAT studies in South Asia show differences in the way boys can be used. A small study of exploitation of boys in prostitution in Hyderabad in India reported there were few pimps and largely female customers. Then in Lahore and Peshawar in Pakistan, researchers described boys having sex with older men in long-term relationships that were not always based on money. And thirdly, the exploitation of boys in prostitution in Bangladesh was found to be a traditional practice based in hotels, in homes, and on the street. Pimps were controlled the boys through fear and violence. Now, Love 146, we've been doing some research with Young Male Matters and some others as well. But primarily we started by doing research with Young Male Matters, and that was because they're the most accessible. So we worked with an organization called Samabhavana in Mumbai in India, and then in Phnom Penh and in Siem Reap in Cambodia, we worked with an NGO called Har Places Community, and the plan is that for us to do in Kampong Som, one of the third major cities, with an organization called Iris Ministries in Malok Pang later next year. We've also done research in Manila in the Philippines, and that's currently being written up. And we've done most recently done research in Chiang Mai, Thailand, with an organization called Urban Light. And we're planning to do one more in Colombo in Sri Lanka in 2014. So we should have quite a significant number of case studies, a number of surveys that we've done in each of these countries, in each of these cities. We've been able to do 50 interviews, and sometimes more than that. With the research that we did with Matter Boys in Mumbai, we had a baseline of 79 Matter Boys who worked on the streets. When we looked at the age that they started working as amateurs, 9% were 12 to 13 years old, 44% were 14 to 15 year olds, 27% were 16 and 17 year olds, and then 15% were 18 and 19, and 5% were 20 and 21 years old. When we asked them had they experienced violence from the police, most of these Master Boys were working on the street, and so they were particularly vulnerable to experiencing violence. So we had 27% said that sometimes, and 21% said always, 18% said very often, only 34% that they said that they'd never experienced that. So given the opportunity, we asked, would you take a new job? 47% said maybe, possibly, and 47% said definitely. Now, the significant thing about this was that we were then able to offer them a training program in motor mechanics as a group to this whole group of young men in the study, and we had a very good, successful outcome. When we followed up this research a year later, we found that most of the boys were still, they had managed to complete the training, and they'd gone on to do a job, which was then given to them after they'd done the training. So that was very encouraging for some above now and the NGOs that were working to try and tackle it. One of the questions we asked was, how much respect do you have for yourself as a masseur? And you can see here 80% said, in a scale of 1 to 10, said just between 1 and 3. So there are a number of significant other things, other than sexual health, that we need to take notice of. Now, this was an interesting finding. When we asked their place of origin, we found that 58% came from one particular area. Now, the significant thing about that, of course, is that then the organisation involved were able to go back to that particular village and district, and then they've been able to do some education in that area, look for potential vocational opportunities in that area. So that's really good news, because it means that they can do some serious prevention work. They were able to work with some of the elders in the village as well and educate them about some of the real serious dangers of boys coming into this kind of work. When we did research with Matter Boys in Phnom Penh, we found that 1/3 said that they found it very difficult to find another job. 1/4 said that they needed the money, and being a masseur would allow them to make money quickly. And then there were other reasons, like little education. Being a masseur, they considered to be an easy job requiring little skills. When we asked about their future, although 11% were unsure what they wanted to do in 2 years, the majority had quite clear ideas about what they wanted to do. So that was encouraging. 31% said they wanted to be some kind of a business owner, and another 13% said being a hairdresser, and 31% had another specific job that they mentioned. 60% said that they planned to save money. So that was good. And we asked them, how can these young men be helped? We asked ourselves, how can these young men be helped to achieve their goals? This is important. We also did our research with Master Boys in Siem Reap, which is in the north of Cambodia, and we did that with 50 boys. And we did, in that particular area, we were able to make a comparison between the massage places that were focused on male to male and then mixed massage places. We found that for the male to male places, they were usually hidden from public view. They were a very sexualized environment with phallic symbols, which implied sexual services. The masseurs presented to clients behind a glass showcase, usually shirtless, and they were advertising within local and international gay bars and hotels and resorts. So it was quite clear who they were looking for. Now, with the mixed gender massage places, they were very public. The masseurs tended to stand on the street to advertise. They usually provided simple massage services provided in the front, and then other services like body, back, oil massages were provided in private rooms in the back or upstairs. Now, the interesting thing was that 47% of these boys report being forced to have sex. Young men in mixed gender massage establishments reported significantly lower incidence of sexual intercourse, but they were far more likely to have been forced to have sex against their wishes. So, some quotes here from the young men themselves. "I was forced to have sex. He got angry, but I disagreed. Usually customers never tell us up front they want sex. He did something to me that I didn't like, and he had strong sexual urges. I told him that I didn't like it." And then thirdly, "Sometimes they ask me, sometimes they force me. If I disagree, they become angry with me." Now, in Chiang Mai, we've recently had just completed this research. So we're still in the process of analysing, but that was a baseline of 51 young men. When we looked at the area of discrimination, 80.5% reported negative personal feelings associated with their work. Nearly half of them said that they felt ashamed. More than 1/3 indicated having low self-esteem, and nearly 1/3 indicated feeling guilty. And you can see there the differences between the different groups. So, although most of them were working as male massage, we also had some working in show bar, were working freelance in the bars, and some in the KTV bars as well. Two of the quotes from there was, "I don't like the guy customers because I feel like I shouldn't be doing it, and it's against who I am. It's against my values, and I don't want to do it, but I have to because I need the money." So with this group in Chiang Mai, Thailand, when we looked at violence and sexual abuse, 1 in 4 of the respondents said that they've been forced to have sex against their wishes by the client, and then 60% of the respondents have experienced unwanted sexual touching in the past 12 months. One of the things that we found in doing research was we compared doing research with individuals or doing research in focus groups. We wanted to do some work with focus groups, but when we piloted it, we realized that many of the young men were very reluctant to talk about anything that they'd done with their peers. Even with their peers, they were embarrassed about it. So we had to review that and decided that we had to resort to surveys in private. So we weren't able to do that. Now, we feel that this has implications for them on the kind of experiences that they have. If they are unable to talk about what they've experienced with their peers, then how do they know if the things that they experience are considered normal or whether they're particularly abusive? In addition to men using boys for sex, of course there's also women who also seek boys for sex and pay for it. And there are some female tourists looking for temporary exotic young male partners, and they have been doing that for decades in a well-established phenomena in certain areas, for example, in Thailand and in Bali. This is often described as a holiday romance rather than a prostitution. The idea that women can be sex tourists in the same way as men has been challenged, but the similarities may outweigh the differences. Research is certainly needed about sexual abuse of boys by teachers, both male and female teachers as well. What's been the responses of NGOs so far? Well, I'll give you some examples of some good examples of what's been done so far. Hard Places community in Cambodia is providing alternative employment for masseur boys in Phnom Penh, and also looking to develop that into Siem Reap in the future. Urban Light in Chiang Mai is providing a drop-in centre for boys who are working in the bars in Chiang Mai in Thailand. They're providing English classes and exploring other ways to work with young men and for men to provide alternative employment. The Stairway Foundation in the Philippines have produced an animation called A Good Boy, which tells the story of a street boy being used by a sex tourist. Information about that can be found from Stairway Foundation. Love 146 and Chab Dai have developed a toolkit for the prevention of sexual abuse, exploitation of children, with a story of children which involves both girls and boys who've experienced or have been groomed for sexual abuse. This mainstreams the idea that boys as well as girls can be abused. If you go to www.good-touch-bad-touch-asia.org, you can find the toolkit there. This is the information here, and if you check out the internet, you can go into that. Love 146, some of the plans that we have, well, we've been supporting partners who are working with young men and transgender in India, Thailand and Cambodia. We support drop-in centres and vocational training. We support dorms away from the red light areas. And as well as research with, well, sometimes called short hair, masculine guys, we're also doing research with long hair, transgender people. We're also looking to do more research looking at the clients of young men and their perspective so that we can understand better ways that we can do information, provide information to people who are seeking sex with young men. We plan to develop tools to use to encourage gay sex tourists and other tourists to report if they see particularly young boys being exploited. And we're rolling out the Good Touch, Bad Touch flip charts in other countries in Asia, including Bangladesh, Nepal, Thailand and Vietnam. I'm just going to take you back to the previous one. What I forgot to mention with that is that this flip chart has got 2 girls and a boy in it. So it normalizes the idea that boys can also be sexually exploited and abused too. So some of the recommendations I would like to make from the research that we're doing is that legal reform and enforcement, investigation and prosecution, educating legal profession and the police needs to be a priority for those of us who are working in abolition. Boys are consistently exposed to high levels of violence, so there's education of those responsible for them and self-protection. Boys are major earners for the family, so family debt may be a major factor in keeping them on the street. So there are options that are needed for that in trying to alleviate debt. As many of these boys have said, they can't discuss sex or sexuality with family or friends, so that means that they may not really understand the risks. So we need to educate boys on what abuse is and what's inappropriate. More and more younger boys are being brought into prostitution due to higher earning potential, and there seems to be little understanding of the ramifications of prostitution on psychosocial and sexual health. More education is needed at the community level about this. Okay, thank you very much. If you've got any questions, then please let me know.